Welcome. This is the podcast series dedicated to living a revenue culture. The revenue culture is the result of two things that businesses have to survive. One is they have to have, over the long term, profitable revenue, and they have to have a team, a culture, a people-first organization that delivers that revenue to customers for the very, very long period of time. And we're going to bring to you in this series some people who have been doing that for a long time, or at least they've been worried about doing that for a long time and trying to figure it out. We're fortunate today to have Susan Foley with us. Susan's the founder and CEO of Corporate Entrepreneurs, LLC. Susan and I have been friends for a long time, and I've watched her succeed in healthcare, education, technology. She's an author, a speaker, a consultant, a senior executive, and now she's running a company that, in my opinion, makes a really big impact on how tomorrow's businesses are going to have to be organized. So Susan, welcome. I'm glad to have you with us.
It's great to be here, Rick.
Now, Susan, I have to ask the basic fundamental question. How did you start Corporate Entrepreneurs LLC? I mean, that's not something most of us get up in the morning and say, I think I'll create a company to do that.
Well, that's a great question, Rick. I spent most of my career building new businesses inside existing organizations. I seem to look at the business world a little differently than all of my peers, and they looked at what I did and thought, well, that's kind of crazy. And so I didn't think it was crazy. It made sense to me. So I decided that I was going to explore what did it take to develop new business growth. Why was I successful? Why were other people not successful? And so that kind of started me on my journey at looking at how do we build capabilities inside organizations that enable organizations to develop new business growth. And I decided that I needed to look at it from a systems perspective, to take a look at it. And I clinged on to this concept called corporate entrepreneurship or intrapreneurship. And you can think about that as like bringing a startup inside an existing organization. What you're trying to do is build the capabilities to enable these organizations to be much more innovative, and create value and generate that new revenue growth. So context was important. And I think that most organizations just looked at innovation as their engine of growth. I said, no, there's context around that. Or you can think of culture as kind of the context within which, you have to develop these new innovations, because I think culture can impact these innovations. They can impede their progress or they can help facilitate the process. Now, herein lies the issue. The issue is that most organizations don't have an entrepreneurial culture. They've spent most of the last decade streamlining their operations to become more efficient, much more effective. That's great in a stable environment, but we're not in a stable environment. Everything is really changing. And so organizations need to look at a new way of operating to generate that revenue, because it's not as easy. Things are changing faster. And I think there's more uncertainty and complexity than ever before. So we need things like the revenue roadmap and things that align the needs of the market more closely to the customers and to the capabilities within an organization. So culture is important, in actually facilitating new revenue growth in organizations.
Does culture ever get in the way of facilitating that?
Oh, all the time. I think, the way I've looked at it is I find that anything in the organization and everything in the organization is a potential barrier, an obstacle to growth. So it isn't that I can identify and say, oh, you got these 5 barriers and obstacles. Think about it a different way and look at the person and say, how do we train that individual to deal with those barriers and obstacles? We've got to teach people how do you overcome those obstacles and barriers to be more successful in an organization. So, I don't focus on here are the 90 barriers I found. These are the things you need to be able to be competent in addressing and, dealing with those barriers when you encounter them.
And Susan, when I've read your books, and obviously we've talked about this kind of thing before, But when we talk about the people in the corporation trying to get that innovation into the market, and the way they should be doing that is through this entrepreneurial spirit and approach and process. Who are the people that are critical in this? I mean, obviously there's somebody they give the responsibility, you go be our corporate entrepreneur, but who do they deal with, and who presents obstacles, and who brings them help over time?
Well, I think it's some of the issue is that the senior management in most organizations have never been entrepreneurial. Their whole focus has been on, the traditional core business and making sure that they're exploiting that business. Here we've got a new opportunity, which is kind of exploring new opportunities. And I always look at it, and this is an exaggeration, but it's like about 180-degree difference. So what I do is I kind of look at the people who are different, the people who think differently, act differently, make decisions differently, and see the world in a different way, because they're saying, hey, there's more possibility out there than the organization sees. There's more opportunity. I see it. And I need an organization that helps sponsor what I'm doing and is committed to do what I'm doing. And so it's middle management, it's senior management, and it's the people who are actually doing the work. And those three levels really have to be integrated in a way when they're working on new innovations. And that's what I've tried to help organizations do, is align those resources, both at the senior level and at the lower levels, to enable them to be more effective in moving innovations out into the market.
Some of the things that we found are particularly important for both revenue and culture is some common language and some common, you used off camera, you used the word context. Context is something we find that if people don't see the same context, you get the battle of contexts. My engineering one's fighting your marketing one. And, how has that impacted what your research is and your writings about?
Well, it's interesting because when I first started out, I was looking at the entrepreneur or the entrepreneurial person inside an organization and saying, so what do they need? What are the competencies and behaviors that they need? And so I developed tools that would enable them to see how innovative they were. But over time, I began to realize that they need to understand the core business, the traditional ways of doing things, and that it's really teaching them about the gap that exists between the entrepreneurial person and the traditional person, and then giving them the tools to enable them to close that gap. Maybe they have to be a little bit more traditional. Maybe they can bring those people who are traditional to be a little bit more entrepreneurial. But that's what it was all about. And that was the big lesson I learned, is that you can't just say, hey, I'm an entrepreneur. You got to go back and deal with the rest of the organization.
Yeah, it's interesting as I'm listening. I found a book that's been out a while, but it's called Challenger Customer. And it's written by the same group that did Challenger Sales. And in the Challenger Customer, they are trying to teach us the profile of customers. And if I were an entrepreneur in a company, my whole company would be my customers before I get to the buyer customers outside my company.
Yes.
And one of the learnings I got from that book was that there's this facilitation role, that I have to be able to facilitate other people with my mission. I can't ignore theirs or steamroll theirs, and I can't be steamrolled by theirs. How do I get us all on the same page? That sounds like that's a critical part of what you've been working on.
Well, it is. And what I'm finding is that a lot about entrepreneurship or corporate entrepreneurship, whatever you call it, it really becomes an education first, and educating everybody about what are we talking about here? What are the differences between a traditional leader in a core business and an entrepreneurial leader in a new business? And really educating them on those things that are needed from a people perspective. But then I'm also looking at the process part of it, is what are the things you need to enable entrepreneurship in your organization? And how does that relate to the culture? And so that's what I think we have to get at, is saying, let's look at this as a holistic kind of approach to generating new revenue. That's really, I think, where we need to get to. And we just can't look at innovation as a process or revenue as a process. It has to have a larger context, a larger enabling system around it.
Yeah, and that's fascinating, because one of the things we've struggled with over the years is two groups of people in a company can use the exact same language and not understand each other at all.
Mhm.
And back when you and I started working together, actually at Digital Equipment Corporation, one of the projects I got to work on there was to help them understand. It was called Salesforce Automation at the time, but it
Mhm.
became CRM. And one of the interesting thing was, if you were in that, as you were talking about the organization getting really efficient and effective at what they've done for the last 10 years, you looked at leads as we would get 1,000 a day or 500 a day. But when you're an entrepreneur or a corporate entrepreneur and you're trying to take something new to the market, you might get 3 leads a month. And leads are the same word, but when we use it, we both get totally different visions of what that means. It makes the conversations very tough.
Well, I can really relate to that. When I worked at HP, everybody would try to get as many leads as possible, maybe 100 leads. I tried to get 10 good ones. So I knew that if I could get 10 good ones, I could maybe get 2, 3 big projects out of that and make my numbers. And, my boss would come to me and beat me over the head and say, how come you don't have 50 or 100 leads? And I say, because they're not the right leads, So I can relate to what you're saying. And what we worked on, I remember at Digital, was actually getting everybody who's involved in the sales process involved in understanding all the dynamics that involve linking the needs of the market to the capabilities in the organization. And that's what's so powerful about what you're doing with the revenue science.
Well, it's, in that part of the conversation, and coming back to the role of the corporate entrepreneur, aligning my own internal resources, where most of those people have other jobs already too. And the other jobs are probably facilitating the ongoing run rate business we've been doing for 10 years. And is there a challenge of getting attention of those other resources I need?
Oh, absolutely. And I don't think it's fair to the entrepreneur that they only have 20% or 15% of their time to work on something. This has got to be a dedicated, focused, educational, training, experiential environment for these people to understand what it's going to take for them to be effective, in an organization. So I agree with that.
How do organizations measure a corporate entrepreneur? Because obviously, if somebody takes that job, I'm assuming there's a little risk with taking that job, and
Yeah.
you want to at least know how I'm going to be measured if I'm going to go do this. What does that look like in real life?
Well, quite frankly, I think most of the metrics that are currently being used, certainly around entrepreneurs and entrepreneurship, are really outdated. They're rigid and they're inflexible. They're tangible. Most organizations look at the financial metrics, and if you don't meet the financial metrics, your innovation idea is not going to meet the hurdle. I saw that time and time again. So high value, high profitability innovations got killed before they even got, to see the light of day. And I think that what I look at is, what are the real metrics? What are you trying to change? What are you trying to do in an organization? So we don't look at the intangible metrics. So we started to put together processes that looked at both the tangible and the intangible, and had organizations weight them according to how it was important to whatever was going on. Because to our earlier point, innovation and revenue growth is all about change. And
Yes.
so we need to measure things that we want changed. And yes, financial is exactly what most organizations want, but there are other things that organizations need. The intangibles, I think, are just as vital.
Give me an example of some intangibles that organizations should be thinking about.
Well, I think that one of the things was, and I can give it my own example, but when I worked at Standard & Poor's, we were building new innovations that were state of the art. They were actually hurting some of the other businesses because they were much more innovative. And so they were always looking at what's the financial return. Well, what we were really trying to do is create an entrepreneurial environment, change how leaders had done, leverage new technology. These were benefits and values that were intangible, but it wasn't until afterwards did people begin to see, wow, look at the value we received from doing this project. We understand new technology. We've created a new culture. We see a new leadership style. We've taken, our products to a higher level that has more value for our customers. So I think there's a lot of intangible things, new technology, new leadership styles, ability to deal with ambiguity and uncertainty, keeping people engaged and energized about work. These
Yes,
are all
yes.
things that organizations don't value, and I think they need to in this new environment.
But it's interesting as you're describing that. And you and I have talked about this before. In revenue science, we use the bell curve as an example, and we talk about the left side where the innovators and early adopters, and the right side where the laggards are. And it sounds like at Standard & Poor's, you are on the left side, starting to create things that in 5 years would be in the middle of the market and able to produce big volume opportunities if you understood them and knew how to act on them. And if you don't do those things, 5 years from now, you're going, well, what do we do next?
Yes.
Is
Yeah.
that accurate?
Yeah, and I think with your bell curve, certainly we start to see the iterative process, the life cycle of products, which I don't think a lot of people understand, that is going to move from something unique and different and high value to more of the commodity as you move along the bell curve. But I think the thing that the bell curve helped me understand was the clarity about how do we take innovations and align them more strategically to the market, so that we're minimizing the risk and we're increasing the success of
Yeah.
these products and services that are in the market now, or we're trying to put into the market. So yeah, I think the value is certainly for entrepreneurs using some of the tools that revenue science has developed, is taking it to another level of refinement in them being better able to have these tools to enable them to be more effective in getting those products not only understood by the core business and the market, but the value that they bring out of those products and services.
I love what you just said there. And, when you mentioned the market, a lot of the work we do focuses on how do we design our business from the buyer's frame of reference back.
Mm-hmm.
And if I'm the corporate entrepreneur, I'm assuming not only do I have to understand our innovation, but I need to understand the buyer out there that this innovation is going to make a difference in their world. Is that a struggle for them? I mean, does their organization support that and make it easy? Or do they have to both fight, it's hard to do to begin with, and my organization's not helping me?
Well, I think it's very difficult for entrepreneurs. And I think that in a lot of very large organizations, we have a lot of MBAs who are doing all this market research and looking for a market, they're looking for an anomaly in the market there. But the entrepreneur is out there talking to the customer and is identifying what the real need is. And I had one of the entrepreneurs that I've worked with, her research department said, this is not going to fly, and they were going to shut down her innovation. She came back and said to the organization, look, I'm going to bring you customers who are saying this is exactly what they want. What are we doing here? So I think there's always that tug and pull. And so the more you understand the customer and you understand the capabilities of the organization, I think that's when that alignment minimizes all that risk that you take in a new innovation. And your tools help organizations do that. So I think it's something that entrepreneurs have to look at and say, hey, how do I take this to the next level? And I think your tools enable them to do that.
Yeah, that's struggling with big organizations to get them to believe that customers want to actually share. And, my experience is that customers really are dying to talk to somebody who knows something they don't know that can help their business get better
Yeah.
and is in effect investing to make the customer's world better.
Yes, absolutely.
And one of the language pieces we've used is every business gets to decide, do they make money from their customer or with their customer?
Yeah.
And the more an organization moves to that right side of the curve and they're in the commodity type business, the more the tendency is to make money from them. Because you assume you're competing with other people who do what you do, and you're competing to win the customer, like the customer's yours from that point on. Where the entrepreneur, my belief is they're listening to real humans out there who have real problems and jointly trying to come to an answer. Am I oversimplifying?
No, I think, it's interesting in hearing you, I think that, the entrepreneur is focused on the value creation, where the organization isn't necessarily focused on that as much because they don't understand how that value creation may translate into value for the company. And so, how does the entrepreneur really get his message across? And so I think you have to bring that buyer mentality, that buyer need into the market and integrate that back into I'll call it the value chain, whatever, to get them to understand that this is really important to them.
That is so exciting to me because the whole business model, I believe, going forward is about value transfer.
Mm-hmm.
And if we being the seller, can't get the buyer to understand and appreciate the value we're bringing, they'll never pay us for it.
Absolutely.
And so part of the skill set every company's got to get is, if I'm really a thought leader and I really help buyers do something they can't do without me, almost by definition, I have to teach them what that means.
Yes.
And once I teach them what that means, then part of my job is to help them preview what their world will look like when they partner with us.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And once they can preview that, then they can imagine what the monetization will be from doing that.
Mm-hmm.
Then they just might pay us for it.
Well, it sounds like the same difficulty you have in getting across some of the concepts around the revenue science are the same issues that we have about getting the organization to see the value of entrepreneurship. And so it is that education that brings everybody to that aha moment, that I think they begin to see, okay, we're doing something very different here now than we've done in the past.
And it's interesting, we've identified, we've had a revenue roadmap for decades, but we've now recognized that the managing that is about the flow, and the flow is by offer. So if I'm the entrepreneur and I'm working on a particular offer we're taking to market, what I want to measure is the flow. Well, the flow is a combination of volume, how many go through, velocity, but the real critical one is value.
Mm-hmm.
And it's your story of, do I have 10 leads or do I have 100? If I have 10 leads that produce more volume than 100, then 10 was a pretty good idea. And so we've got to train. And I've got a series of things I give to companies that in every meeting, somebody should ask, what's the value to the customer to this conversation?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And if nobody knows the answer, that should tell us something.
Right.
Maybe quit the conversation or figure out why it's important. And I would think for the entrepreneur in the company, that's an everyday mission.
Well, it is, and it's something I learned from you years ago, is that everybody has a different value. So if you've got sitting in that same room, the CFO, the CEO, the COO, the CTO, and you've got them sitting there, they each look at that same thing and having a different value. So as an entrepreneur, I need to understand what's the value to this person and what's this value to this person. And then you need to be the one who is proactively helping them understand what you're doing and what it means in terms of their value. And that was a valuable lesson I learned from you. So I appreciate that.
Well, I think that's one of the biggest challenges for every organization, whether I'm selling in my organization or I'm selling outside my organization, is that mission. And often we get in trouble, particularly salespeople selling externally. But I know each of those silos you mentioned, and it could be engineering and finance and so forth, we tend to go tactical in our conversation. You know,
Yes.
we want to talk about the details. Well, the truth is, the other people in the room don't even understand the details that we're talking about. They don't use the same language that we use.
Yes.
And none of that detail is where you identify the value. The value is really up in the Simon Sinek world of why. And it's at the concept level.
Yes.
And it's much easier to get those different people to work together if we start at the mission purpose level of the conversation, where they all go, well, of course, that's what we need to do. And then you go, okay, how might we get there? Because you each have different purposes. How might we combine those? And then eventually you get to the minutiae, which is where the arguments would normally be. And we do it backwards most of the time.
Well, it's interesting what you're saying, because I think in many ways, we're trying to teach them something that they haven't experienced.
Absolutely.
And so what we find is that if you get the executives involved in the process at a little different level, being immersed in understanding what it takes to be an entrepreneur, they can see that value more closely, more quickly. So it's a challenge, I think, to get people to understand something they can't see. I had an entrepreneur say to me once, she says, she reported into the CEO and she said, they don't see what I say because they hadn't had an experience base where they could relate to it. Had they been through a similar experience, they might say, I get what she's saying. But she had to step back and communicate in a different way to meet their needs, and it was kind of an interesting twist on things.
Yeah, and one of the things that's become pretty obvious, and the pandemic accelerated it, was the fact that we all have to be better facilitators, where just pitching and telling doesn't accomplish a whole lot. And if we can help facilitate different people to ask better questions and see some of those things that why 10 is better than 100, or it's at least another option to 100. We've got to become much better facilitators, because just pitching, and one of the things from a cultural standpoint that I'm deaf on is first person. And when I look at proposals companies create, and you look at the cover letter, and I'm not kidding you, in 3/4 of a page, I've seen 60 first person in 3/4 of a page cover letter. I, me, we, my company, my product name. And you're just telling the customer, all I really care about is this deal. It's really important I get this deal. There's no customer in it at all.
Yeah.
And so, that's a big challenge. And that's part of that cultural thing.
Yes. And I was in sales and trained by large companies who said, you talk about your company first and then the customer. And boy, I couldn't handle that. They were snoozing by that time.
Yeah. Well, that was, everybody wanted to product train you so that you could just spew the product information. And of course, the internet today has allowed the customer to know everything about your product there is to know, probably more than the salesperson knows before you even get there.
Yeah, big challenge.
So tell me, Susan, as you look at the post-pandemic world, what we've learned about the fact that the corporate entrepreneur's work is critical because Jeffrey Moore wrote Escape Velocity a few years ago, and he talked about why we don't fund corporate entrepreneurs and what the challenges were. And his analysis was, from a Wall Street standpoint, you never invest in the corporate entrepreneur because the same amount invested in the current product gets a bigger return for Wall Street.
Right.
So it has to be strategic because it's certainly not short-term tactical, at least according to Jeffrey, and I believe Jeffrey. So what's the future? What should we be looking at or thinking about, or what do people have to do if they, this whole series is about how do we combine the need for revenue and the need for a people-first organization for the long term. So thinking about this, what's the long term on this?
Well, I think there's a couple things that I see happening that I think are going to facilitate what we're talking about. I think one is the fact that organizations are coming out of the pandemic and need to grow. And so they're going to be having to look for new growth. At the same time, you have a whole generation and multiple generations of people who want to be entrepreneurial, who want to make a contribution, who want to provide social value, and also be financially responsible. But the thing is I think those two pressures have come together at the same time. I mean, there was a report that said in 2028, 50% of employees will be self-employed. And think about that. So I think those two pressures, the need to grow and talent who's saying, we want to work in an organization that has value and is providing value for society and financially. I think those two pressures coming together are going to force organizations to be more entrepreneurial. And I think that's what the recent McKinsey report said, was that business model innovation is the focus of most CEOs moving forward after the pandemic. So I think it's a bright future for what you're doing, and what I'm doing is, how do we refine our understanding of entrepreneurship? How do we get the tools that you provide to really refine it to a level where we're taking out the risk and we're increasing the success, and we're actually showing organizations how to operate differently moving forward?
I get excited. Of course, we always have fun when we talk, but I just get jazzed about this because we've talked to people for years about the culture. And when I get with CEOs, they say, well, we're going to go create a culture. And my response is, you've already created one and you don't like it. Cultures are outcomes. Yeah. And, then the pandemic gave me a year to sit here and think about, all right, if this is so important and we all believe it is, how do we do it so that it works? And the map was already there. When we look at great companies lead with purpose. Mm-hmm. And, whether it's Disney or Nike or Apple or whoever, they all start out with a purpose. They're there for something other than, and you take people like Steve Jobs, who at times didn't even take a salary. It wasn't about the money. Yeah. It was about the purpose. Mm-hmm. And those companies, I have a dear friend of mine who was a great engineer that I worked with, and he was actually a little older than I am, but all he ever wanted to talk about was the best job he ever had was working for Disney. Mm-hmm. And, so these people who work in purpose organizations work harder, they're more loyal, they stay longer. Mm-hmm. And so I think we've made some mistakes in the past. When people talk about right people on the bus, I think a lot of us interpreted that as best resume. Mm-hmm. And I think going forward, we're going to recognize it's really those people who share the purpose. And of course you want a good resume, but first you want people who share the purpose, because you'll have less turnover. Your people will be engaged all the time. They'll bring their friends. I mean, that's some of the things we know about Apple and Disney. The employees recruit more employees. Mm-hmm. And they recruit the right ones. Yes. So if we start with purpose and we use from our toolkit, the revenue strategy, which requires a purpose, and then that transfers value, if that purpose through the strategy transfers value to customers, I think we can create something that's teachable, sustainable, repeatable, and fun for everybody involved. So
Absolutely no. And I think starting with purpose is exactly what you need to do. And I think entrepreneurs would just raise their hand for that as being a focus of where they want to work, why they want to work, and who they will wind up working for in the future is where is this organization? What's their purpose? And do I want to go in and support that purpose?
amen. I had a gentleman ask me yesterday, he says, well, what if their purpose is they want to make a lot of money? And I said, well, that's fine. I mean, that's a legitimate purpose, but just recognize that it's a mercenary purpose
Mm-hmm,
and it's short term and it normally gets connected to a bubble.
mm-hmm.
So you'll be in the housing development business because we got a good housing market now. But as
Yeah,
soon as that's over, you'll go do something else.
that's right.
And don't expect your people to be loyal because you've taught your people we're in this, so I make as much money as possible. So what would your people think? Well, they should make as much money as possible. And as soon as somebody offers them $5 more, they're going to leave you.
That's right.
So don't be surprised.
Mm-hmm. Yes, absolutely.
So, and I can see if I'm an entrepreneur in a company and I got a purpose and my company's mercenary, that could be a really bad fit.
Well, and it's interesting too. I think you're absolutely right. I think a lot of entrepreneurs are finding that out, and they are leaving. You know, they've reached the boundaries of what they think where they can push the organization, and it's basically based on exactly what you're saying. The purpose has become very clear to them that that's not the purpose they want to support.
Yeah. And as you were talking about the future, the younger people today know how to use the web to make things transparent.
Mhm.
And frequently they'll know the purpose and the reality of the business culture before they either do or don't apply.
Right, right.
And as leaders, we better figure that out or we're going to be in trouble needing employees in the next 2 years anyway. We sure don't want to make it worse.
Yes. And it's interesting when you talk about purpose too, because I think that um, the real value that entrepreneurs are bringing is the fact that it's that experience base that they're bringing with them, to an organization. And so the more organizations where there's a purpose that had value, they're going to be more valuable. They will have learned more and they become much more valuable in the marketplace. So it's kind of this iterative process that continues to go on.
Yes, yeah. And as you were talking about them actually, the lady where she said, I can actually bring you real life customers who tell us this is really cool. That's an opportunity for a company to get feedback on its purpose. I mean, if the entrepreneurs identified a purpose the customer's excited about and everybody else is just treating us as a commodity vendor, maybe we ought to learn something from that.
Yes, absolutely.
So, Susan, last question for you. What should we be thinking about as it relates to big entities? And by big, I'm talking typically above $100 million up to 100 billion or whatever that top side is. What should they be thinking about so they don't end up stuck doing the same thing year after year when all of a sudden the market doesn't care anymore? How do they get that shot of new or exciting or valuable earlier and make it part of their business model, their culture?
Well, that's a great question. And I think that what I'm starting to see is that organizations are actually supporting building a cadre of entrepreneurs or innovators inside their organizations. So they're sending them away to schools to learn about what it takes to be an entrepreneur. So I think there's this recognition that organizations need to evolve and move forward and grow and be innovative. And so they're looking at the individual entrepreneur and they're starting to invest in them. And I think that's really strategic moving forward. I think the next step is for the senior management to go through that same process, to
Yeah.
experience that same experience base so that they can relate, because this is this gap that entrepreneurs have to close. And until both sides understand both worlds, the core business and the new business that you're building, there's going to be that gap and it's going to be up to somebody. And it's normally the entrepreneur who's going to have to close that gap.
I always get at least one light bulb when we talk, and you just put one off for me. And that is, I've worked with so many senior groups, and they look at their business as I have a stream of RFPs coming in. And that's how they think of their business, where the entrepreneur is looking at these whole new high value problems that this company could solve if they
Mhm.
recognized they were worth solving.
Yes.
And there's just the conversation's almost impossible because the C-suite just sees RFP after RFP after RFP, which are low margin, high competition, and the entrepreneur seeing all this exciting opportunity if we'll just take the time to focus on it. That's a great takeaway for me.
Good. Well, I think it's these two worlds collide. And I think what I'm seeing, and I think the future is bringing those two worlds together. You can still be separate, you can still be different, but how do we bridge that gap? And how far do we have to move to the left, to the right to do that?
Yeah. Well, I want to thank you just so much for being here today because we've had so much fun talking over the years, and I've just
Absolutely.
admired your work so much, and I think yours and mine match really, really well. And hopefully, the people watching this today are going to feel exactly the same way.
Well, thank you, Rick. It's always great to talk to you, but it's always enlightening. I've learned so much from you. And I think your stuff and what I'm doing here, the revenue science techniques that you're doing and what I'm doing are just so well married or matched that we need to figure out a better way to closely link them.
Great. So, for anybody who wants to get a hold of Susan, her email is and her website's on the screen. You can reach out to her anytime you want. You can buy her books. You won't have any trouble finding them. Matter of fact, she's got one right there behind her. And she's got a great blog. It's one of the few I read every paragraph, every page on every time they come out. So I strongly recommend her books and her blog. So I thank you for joining us today, and we'll look forward to you the next time. Thank you.
Thank you, Rick.